Okay, we're going to get cracking. Settle down. Thank you so much all for coming. This is a very squeezed room. We will try to be as informative and entertaining, enlightening and controversial for you all as possible. My name's Hugh. I used to be a doctor, and now I work in health tech, specifically in the regulatory space around AI and software medical devices. And I've been asked by Keith Grimes, who many of you know, to chair this session, which is pointedly titled The Trouble with AI. We are joined by an excellent panel. Rachel is Chief Executive of the Patients Association. And a fun fact is she's always early. Nell works at the Health Foundation, and she used to be a classical opera singer. There we go, fun fact. And Harris is a clinical academic, but also runs Newton's Tree, which he'll explain what that does. And a fun fact about Harris is there are no fun facts about Harris.
It's true, that's true.
So the trouble with AI. I'm going to start with a conjecture, and then we'll go around the panel. Everything that we do in medicine, everything, has a benefit, but it also has a risk. There are two sides to a coin. Are we currently only focusing on the benefits and putting our heads in the sand about the potential risks? And I'm going to go straight to Rachel on that, as our patient representative on the panel. How do you view AI from the patient point of view? And are you happy with the way we're addressing benefits and risks at the moment?
Okay, since I was late, they decided to come to me first. So the Patient Association is a non-disease, non-condition specific charity, and we look at things that affect all patients. So AI is obviously something that we're really interested. And AI has amazing positives. We've seen the shift that the government are now looking at from digital to analog, from analog to digital. But there are things that we need to be aware as we address this massive expansion in AI. So if I was to talk about the barriers that I see right now for patients, I think one of the barriers is that we're not talking enough about the trade-offs. The trade-offs in terms of human interaction and time and that personal touch, that shared decision making where we have that conversation about what really is important to patients. And what is important to the individual, and how can AI really measure that is for me is one of the issues. The other issue that we have is that we have to be careful that whatever we do with digital and AI doesn't exacerbate health inequalities. And I'm coming from this really positive about AI, so I'm really just raising barriers. This isn't about me sitting here saying it's all bad stuff. It's not. It's going to be amazing, and it has to be the future of healthcare. But we've got to think about inequalities of health, because otherwise we will end up with even wider inequalities of health. We've got to think of those trade-offs in terms of that human interaction, which is really, really important to each and every one of us. And we need to think about the role that patients can play with you in developing. So nothing should be developed unless it's developed in partnership with patients who are going to be using the service, because at the end of the day, it's their lives that are going to be affected from it. So I think they would be the three barriers I'd want to talk about if I was going to talk about problems. But there are solutions.
We'll get on to the solutions, hopefully. I was going to move to Harris. Harris said something very interesting to me in our prep for this session. And he said, the time is now to get serious. What did you mean by that?
Sorry, I had to remember what I said. I've been fortunate enough to be, like you, Hugh, involved in AI in some capacity for almost 10 years. And for me, there's sort of like a probably COVID era, pre-2020 era of AI in healthcare, where, to be frank, it was a lot of just fun and scientific curiosity. To give you a bit more about my background, I'm an NHS clinical scientist. I built and led the AI team at Guy's and Tommy's, and a lot of the work that we were involved in, whether it was developing AI or deploying AI, and broadly across the system in the NHS, was often not led by either the patient voice or what were the clinical or operational priorities, to be frank, right? It was driven a lot by people like myself who were clinical academics and our own sort of personal interests. Now we're in a completely different position with their ecosystem, right? It's a much more mature market, and the health system is much savvier than it was 5-10 years ago, right? And now, throughout organizations, not just the clinicians or the academics, but the folks in procurement, the folks in information security and governance, and even trust boards are expecting much more from our vendors, right? And so, and that's what I mean about getting serious. And the reality is for those out of the innovators and the early adopters who were in it for the novelty, their time is over, right? And the mission now for all of us in this room as an ecosystem is how do we seriously use AI to deliver patient benefit and operational efficiencies? Not only because, as I mentioned, the technology is mature and so is the health system, but also the challenges that are facing the health system have become existential, right? Waiting lists, for example, in radiology reporting, cancer diagnosis times, all of these things have reached critical limits, right? And there isn't suddenly going to be an avalanche of doctors falling out of medical school or foundation programs, right? And so we have to think about how do we seriously, if we can, use digital and AI technologies to at least partially address some of these problems, and that's what I mean.
So it's not just the developers who have to get more serious, it's the NHS or the buyers as well have to get more serious about what they're purchasing.
It's every stakeholder, and with often novel technologies, it's assumed that it's just the technologist who's the stakeholder in this adoption journey, but it gets touched by everyone and everyone touches it. Whether you're part of a procurement process, you're, like I mentioned, the information security or governance person, the commercial team, the MHRA, the CQC, all of us are party to this adoption journey, right? And we all have to play our role effectively, right? It's no longer something that you let the universities or the startups do, right? It's now on our threshold, and we have to deal with the challenge and the opportunity.
With great power comes great responsibility. That's another way to say that there are benefits and risks. And I think Uncle Ben from Spider-Man says it so much more eloquently than any health tech evangelist can say. Now, you're from the Health Foundation. You guys have done research and produced reports on this. You've looked at risks of AI. What do you think are the biggest risks that we might be walking into? And are there ways to mitigate them?
Yeah, so just to echo Rachel's point, I think often when you talk about the downsides of AI, you can be painted as wanting to block progress or not necessarily believing in it as a technology, and I don't think that's the case, but I think we need to be realistic about what it can achieve. You know, let's be realistic, it's not been adopted at scale in the health service yet. There isn't widespread evidence that it's going to do all the things we do. We hear so much about the potential of AI, and in fact it's probably that kind of hope that's brought most of you here today, but it leads us to a question, with all the hope and the hype behind it, why haven't we done more to adopt it? Why are we where we are? And so at the Health Foundation, we've done a lot of research into looking at the problem with implementation and what people think about AI. And what we conclude largely is that the lack of progress has been down to a lack of coordination. And so far, there's lots of things happening in lots of pockets all around the health service, but without any sort of overarching strategy, all of those efforts are currently adding up to less than the sum of their parts. And that's an issue when we think about inequalities, because often when we say things like inequality in AI, people think about things like bias. Now, that's absolutely true, but you can design the most perfect, unbiased AI system that ever lived. If you don't get implementation right, that is not going to matter. And what we're seeing is that AI is being adopted in pockets of excellence in the health service. Big trusts with lots of resources, lots of very talented people are driving the adoption of AI. But what about those small remote hospitals? Who's driving it there? And so what we're going to see are massive inequalities growing in both access and outcomes, because some trusts will have it, some patients will have it, and some won't. So we need to get really serious, not just about getting the technology right, but also about getting the implementation and the adoption of that technology right. And our piece calling for a national AI strategy, which we published in the summer, was framed through a lens of responsibility. Because another thing that we hear a lot about is people saying, we need to minimize harm. We need to make sure that it does good for most people. And what we're saying is that's not good enough. It's not good enough to accept that some people might be harmed by these systems. And we're seeing that happen already. We've seen AI systems in America, for example, lead to the denial of care to black patients. That's not okay. And so what we need to do is be really critical, and it's what is AI doing? How can we make sure that it works for all people, society, and the planet? Let's not forget that ChatGPT has already consumed enough electricity to power 33,000 homes. Generating one image with AI can use the same amount of power as fully charging your mobile phone. How do we reconcile that with AI net zero goals? So there's so much about this that even when the technology is perfect, we still need to think really, really carefully about how we're using it, where we're using it, and why are we using it, and is it having a benefit?
You raise a very interesting point that nothing is going to be perfect. And again, nothing we do in medicine is perfect. The best surgeon in the world has complication rates. The most effective drug you give has side effects. So going back to the patient sort of voice in this, how do you think we as a system can best communicate with patients the benefits, as well as being completely transparent and open about the risks? And what level of risk do you think the patients are prepared to accept if we say that an AI is never going to be 100% accurate?
It's a really good question. So the Patient Association talks about patient partnership. And I think, and Nell, I think you said this the last time we spoke at something, like we have to trust the patients understand risk. And it's their lives that we're talking about. And I was thinking when I was late, obviously, and I got a taxi here today, and I told the taxi man he was full of chat, he was lovely, and I told him what I was doing. He said, "Oh, you must be really clever, I just don't understand AI." And I went, "Well, I don't really either, I'm just going to tell you need to work with patients." There's something about, and it was just interesting listening to him talk about the fact that he doesn't have a laptop, he doesn't use email. He's a normal bloke who's going around the streets. So, we've really got to engage that thing about trust and transparency. And so we did a couple of pieces of work recently. We did one piece of work with the department around the Data Pact, around the Data Saves Lives strategy. And what patients were saying was, don't treat us like we don't know. We know there's going to be problems. But let's be honest about what those problems are, and let's be transparent about what will happen when we realize those problems, that if AI is affecting it. The other thing, just very quickly, and another call I had this morning was around with the Royal College of GPs around a training program. And it was with Black Lives Matters as a result of a piece of work that I saw them doing in Parliament a few months ago. And this is where black women are not getting recognised with breast cancer risks as much as white women are. And how come, now there's medics in the audience and they're going to go, "You're not explaining this really well," but how do we make sure that AI doesn't create even further bias if we're not starting with the right people when we're testing it? Because that's where the conversation has to happen, I think.
No.
Yeah, if I could just add to that, I completely agree with the thing Rachel said, but it's really important. Often when we talk about what the public think, we think of them as a homogenous group of people. And at the Health Foundation, so we did a really large survey. We surveyed over 7,500 members of the public representative to ask them what they felt about AI in healthcare. And on the whole, just over half, so on balance, people are supportive of the use of AI in healthcare and even for patient care, and a little bit more so for admin. But it's actually when you start to really dig down into the data that you see some nuance that's often ignored when you just kind of take the whole. We didn't plan this, but I'm feeling a sense of power holding a microphone, so I'm going to do this anyway. So there's some interesting findings. So, for example, if we look at people in socioeconomic groups D and E, so people who are likely on lower or no income, put your hand up if you think they are more supportive of AI than the general public. Okay, a couple of hands. Sorry, no. On the whole, they're less supportive of AI, and we perhaps expect that. What about younger people, the hip, young, cool TikTokers, the 16 to 24s? Put your hand up if you think they're more supportive of AI than the general public. Yeah, again, you're all wrong. So, sorry guys. So actually, when we look at the data, the 16 to 24s, the group that everyone thinks, because they're so tech savvy, they're going to love things like this, actually on the whole, they really hate it. Now, we're going to do some more research next year to really dig into why that is, but it's just really important that we're challenging those assumptions that we have when we're thinking about whether patients will like this or not.
Thanks, that's a fascinating factoid. Thank you so much. Harris, you do a lot of work in actually deploying AI. I wanted to ask you, like, practically, how does it work? Or once you deploy an AI, how are we monitoring the risks and the benefits? How are we actually showing that this stuff is safe and effective and maintaining its performance and not destroying the health system underneath our feet?
Yeah, I think the sad truth is we're not.
We're not.
No, we're not. Yeah. We're quite far along the adoption journey when it comes to AI in the country, right? So 95% of stroke units use AI technology. Almost every trust by now is using some form of AI technology, probably in radiology. I have not met a single organization, and I have a few national roles, so I get to talk to lots of organizations. I've not met a single organization that has any kind of AI audit program.
Is that not an utter travesty?
Of course, yeah. It flies in the face of fundamental clinical governance, right? Which is
and the regulations, I would imagine, as well.
Yeah. And I think there's a failing of that responsibility on both sides, both the care provider and AI vendors. And part of it is because there's a lack of education, right? A lot of people don't realize what their requirements or expectations are. It doesn't help that the regulators also haven't been clear on demanding this. From the vendor side, they're, as you know, required to do post-market surveillance, and that's light touch is sort of a nice way to describe it. The reality, though, is when I talk to hospitals and sort of educate them around what is required, the financial case for a lot of these technologies suddenly looks less attractive, because you're buying this technology because it's going to reduce, burden on administrators or radiologists or whatever the case may be. But now I'm telling you, actually, every 6 months, every quarter, every year or something, you're going to have to sit down, one of your staff members, and go through 10% of the cases or whatever the standard might be, and double read or double process all of these cases. So now you're thinking, well, actually, if I'm having to do all this extra work, what's the actual benefit? And that's a very good question, right? And so a lot of this early adoption has essentially underpriced what the actual cost of adoption is. And that's not to say that means we're not going to adopt any AI. We just have to be investing appropriately, and that includes implementation. And we learned those lessons very painfully with a lot of the early EHR adoptions, right? So when people went digital, they realized they actually underinvested in the training requirement and the service transformation work. And now that we properly invest in, or are better at investing in that sort of stuff, it doesn't kill the EHR business case. It makes it more sobering, though, and we're going through that same process with AI. But thankfully, like I said, there's now much more awareness about these things, and I'm now having lots of conversations, both in the UK and abroad, around how do you set up that kind of capability. And to Nell's point around equality or equity across the country, this is where it becomes challenging, right? So I spent most of my career at Guy's and Tommy's. We have a 20-person AI team, right? That's not going to be possible in every hospital in the country, right? And so then the question is what happens outside of the ivory tower of St. Thomas's? And to be honest, I don't know, right? There needs to be serious conversations very high up at NHS England saying if we want to have equitable and safe access to these technologies, then we have to think about how do we resource not just the plugging the thing in, but making sure it doesn't break afterwards.
It's really interesting that you said that we're not really sure how well we're monitoring AI once it's deployed. Quick poll from the audience. put your hand up if you're a clinician and you're using AI at some point in your work, whether you're using a radiology thing or a cardiology thing or ambient scribe. Okay, keep your hand up really high so I can see them all. Keep your hand up if you know how to make a complaint back to the person who sold that AI to you. One person going, not sure. One person, you know how to make a complaint. Have you made a complaint? You look after regulation for a vendor, so you're the person they complain to. Great. Yeah. So the clinicians in the room, I guess you've heard of the yellow card system where if there's a drug interaction that goes wrong that you can report. Do you know how to report back to the regulators if an AI system goes wrong? So this is the kind of thing that I think we need to educate more widely on. One of the things that we need to do. But another topic you brought up was the health economic side of things. If you're just selling the benefits and you build your business case just on time saving, efficiencies, improved diagnosis, whatever it might be, but you're not including the monitoring of the risks, the surveillance, the human resource involved in maintaining and monitoring a system, are you falsely advertising the price of your AI system? Are you not telling the whole picture? And surely as a patient, especially one using the NHS, don't you want to be sure that the AI is actually cost effective?
Yeah, but I think we could argue that about a lot of activities in the health and care system.
That is true, that is true.
So I think for me, one of the things that we need to get to, and it's about whether, it doesn't matter whether you're using the NHS or independent healthcare, we should be looking at outcomes. And any business case should be looking at the outcomes for patients and society as a whole. So if we go back and think about the inequalities question and your thing about the ivory tower, you know, look at some of the work that the British Red Cross has done in left behind neighbourhoods where they basically don't have a healthcare service, so they're most definitely not going to have AI working or a team of AI people working there. So I think one of the things we've asked in the government and in this 10-year consultation on the long-term plan is that we have to stop commissioning for outcomes. For activities, and we actually have to commission for outcomes across the health and care system, not just AI.
And I think that's what NICE do as a body, is they in some regard, assess at least the potential for outcomes and try and make a recommendation. But to my knowledge, there's very few AI systems that have got a full NICE approval.
Yeah, so I was going to mention this. Yeah, so no, as far as I know, no AI company, or AI product rather, has full NICE approval. Some of them have some sort of halfway approval where you can use them subject to more data collection. And people, I think, unfairly berate NICE, right? And they see that as a barrier to widespread adoption. We have to remember that NICE has, for almost its entire history, been the clinical sort of standard bearer of best practice, right? There's entire countries that set up clinical services based on what NICE says. But for some reason, we think that their function or their service for AI is insufficient or improper. But I think now we're realizing the fact that actually a lot of these technologies come in on very thin evidence, right? Which is fine. Everything new is unknown, right? And so then, what my sort of personal mission has been is how do we set up infrastructure and capability so that we can rapidly figure out what works and what doesn't, right? So we're not lamenting the fact that these things don't have evidence, but actually we use our strengths as a national health system, which is evidence generation on a massive scale, to very quickly prove this works and this doesn't. And just like the rest of the world has done before, they can continue following our lead on safe and effective AI adoption. And I think that's what we should be aiming for.
Aren't you stifling innovation by daring to suggest that we have to gather all that evidence?
Sure, yeah, there's always a trade-off, right? And like I said, I think NICE has historically, on the balance, got it right. And the question is not how do I get things through NICE, is how do I prove what works and what doesn't, right? And so it's just a question of priorities when you're making an investment, rather than either or, right?
You'd think that if the clinical benefits outweighed the risks and the downstream outcomes were so great, that it would almost be like a shoe-in, like NICE would kind of be obliged to give a recommendation. So it's interesting that pretty much nothing has got that full recommendation yet. Do you think that's because we're too early, or do you think there isn't a strong argument for it?
So I think one of the challenges has been is that we've, as an ecosystem, over-indexed on the wrong kinds of use cases. So as an example, Hugh's a radiologist, I'm a MRI physicist, so we're both sort of born in radiology, right? And I'm very open to saying that...
You were born in the dark.
Yeah, I was born in the dark, yeah. You merely adopted the X-rays. Out of all the market-approved AI technologies, 70 to 80%, something like that, are radiology use cases. But if you talk to any health exec, any ICS board, and you say, what are 80% of your problems? No one is going to say radiology, right? So why do we have so many radiology applications? Well, if you think about sort of the early 2010s, when sort of Google and Facebook were developing convolutional neural networks to look at cats and dogs in YouTube videos and things like that, they then turned their attention to healthcare, and the only thing that was really digital then was PACS, right? PACS had been, radiology imaging archives, had been digital for about a decade or two, right? And it looks like a match made in heaven. We detect objects in images. You have lots of digital images, low-hanging fruit, until you look at the health economics, the actual clinical service, and we've realized that actually this is probably not as easy as we thought it would be. But now you're seeing the pendulum swing the other way, and you're seeing lots more operational use cases helping with clinical coding and ambient documentation and some of these other technologies where actually now, because most hospitals have EHRs and other digital systems, those cases that actually deliver more immediate value are now coming to the fore, right? And that's the other reason why NICE has been slow, because actually we were working on the wrong things.
Yeah. There's a brilliant meme, I don't know if you've seen it going around the internet. 3 panels. 2015, Geoffrey Hinton says radiologists won't exist in 5 years. 2017, Elon Musk, electric cars will replace all other cars. You won't need to drive. 2024, radiologists driving in normal cars to their jobs. So none of the predictions have happened. That's not to say we won't stop trying. Nell, you wanted to come in.
Yeah, I just say it louder for the people in the back, really. The strategy piece that we wrote, when we really looked into it, what we saw was that essentially the availability of AI to the NHS is being driven by 2 main sources. Source 1, where data has historically been readily available or is readily available, and source 2 is what industry thinks the NHS needs. And so what we're seeing is a plethora of off-the-shelf solutions that are not tailored to the actual challenges of the health service, and we're seeing managers within the NHS get overwhelmed by company after company after company claiming that they have something they're going to sell them, it's going to revolutionize everything, it's going to change your life. And that's a problem, and it's a problem because we're not targeting actual challenges. Nobody is sitting down and saying, you know what, this is a problem, I can evidence that this is a problem. Is this something that AI might be able to help me with? Can I go and find a company or work with someone to build a solution that's going to have that outcome that I want? That's not happening. What's happening is sheer panic and pressure on the health service, because whilst AI is being sold as something transformational, actually the way it's being implemented is something that is compensating for a decade of underfunding, for a workforce crisis of people not having skills. And so we're seeing AI kind of shoved into highly pressured situations where people don't have the time, the resources and the skills, and they're not being given what they need. And then we're going, why did that not work? And you're like, you really have to ask.
And thank you for mentioning skills. Some people say that one of the risks of ubiquitous AI, if we get there, will be that we would de-skill the professionals who work within the healthcare system. A radiologist who has all his reports automatically generated, you'd suspect, would become a worse radiologist over time because they just get lazy and not know what they're doing anymore. Is that a risk that we should be concerned about, or is this kind of just fantasy?
I think automation bias is a massive risk that we need to be realistic about, right? Like the tendency of people to be told that systems are so good and so accurate that they start to rely on them and they don't question their results. And there have been studies on this. There was one done on, they took a group of radiologists, each with an average of 15 years experience in radiology, and they gave them scans, some of which they'd been deliberately incorrectly labelled. When the radiologists were given those sets of scans, their accuracy rate fell to below 50%.
Yeah, but to be fair, radiologists get inaccurately labelled scans the whole time from A&E. I mean, you know.
Yeah.
patient fell over drunk, and you ask the patient, they go, I didn't fall over, I wasn't drunk, but they had a head scan anyway. So we're very used to getting very short prompts, which are inaccurate, so we're quite good at that as a profession.
Yeah, but what this is saying is that if you're told that prompt came from AI, you're much less likely to question it.
Yeah, you're right. And there's the anchoring bias, so that the first fact that someone shows you, your brain automatically anchors to that fact, and it's harder to argue against it. And I guess on the patient side, who are not expected to be experts in healthcare, if you had an output from an AI system, I think that's more risky because you don't have, through no fault of your own as a patient, all that medical knowledge to kind of make a reasoned judgment of how accurate or sensible that output is.
Yeah, but to be fair, a lot of time patients get letters about the outcomes of their treatment that aren't written in language that they can understand and are written in medical jargon. So I think there's basics we need to get right. I think patients in a lot of the study, in a lot of the very small pieces of work and the focus groups that we've done around this area, have a concern about staff. They know how hard frontline staff are working, and they have a concern about their ability to build this into their work, to have the right kind of training and supervision and appraisal that makes sure that they're adopting AI properly. But I was just listening to talking about AI, and one of the things that came into my head was our helpline this morning and talking to them. Patients are still struggling to see their full medical records. And yet we're sitting here talking about AI and what AI can't do and why we aren't accelerating it as quickly as I think we should be doing and supporting frontline staff and patients in doing that. And yet we have the very basic that, the top inquiry to our website is downloading the how can I see my own medical records. And if we're not getting that basic right, then how can we accelerate AI to the point that we really should be?
You're right. It's sometimes a bit like trying to put a V8 engine into an old Skoda or something. The NHS technical infrastructure is not the most up to date. Aren't they still using Windows XP in some trusts, or even MS-DOS or something like that?
They shouldn't be.
They
It's out of
shouldn't.
support. Uman will know.
Blame Microsoft. No, brilliant. So we've talked about benefits, we've talked about risks, we've talked about the good, the bad, and the ugly. Let's try and finish on some more positive kind of things. So, Harris, from your side, and the work you're doing with Newton's Tree, can you talk to us about some kind of positive things that you see are happening around the deployment of AI, the safety, the assurance of it?
Yeah, happy to. So I'll talk about some of the stuff that we're sort of directly involved in and some stuff that's more broader. In fact, I'll talk about the broader stuff. So I was fortunate enough to be at the Royal College of Surgeons Council meeting, I think last week, and I was giving a talk on AI, and one of the council members, who's a neurosurgeon, came up to me afterwards and said, I use MONAI in my clinical work. And so for those of you who don't know, MONAI is an open source community, so it stands for Medical Open Network for AI. And we started it, Guy's Thomas's and KCL and NVIDIA started it around 2020, when we all realized that we were all trying to do roughly the same thing in the US and the UK around building and deploying AI models. And so we got together and includes institutions from UCSF all the way to Chinese Academy of Medical Sciences. We came together and to build this community and this software library that would make it easy and standardized to build and deploy AI technology. And it's gotten to a state of maturity now where, one, it's adopted by all of the hyperscalers, including some of the incumbent IT vendors like Siemens. And now you have neurosurgeons who are using it themselves as well. And that kind of collaboration around free and open resources, I think, is a really critical part of making AI successful, right? Because with a lot of enterprise technology, transparency isn't often one of the values, and particularly with AI in healthcare, we can't afford to make that mistake of signing up to opaque, impenetrable technologies that we don't understand. So that was really great to hear, and more specifically what we're doing at Newton's Tree. So we've been involved in the AI Diagnostic Fund, which was a fund that was handed out by NHS England last year to deploy chest X-ray, mainly chest X-ray AI technologies across the country. We're working with a few trusts who wanted our help to deploy it, but importantly to monitor it. So we have a monitoring framework and dashboard that allows hospitals to monitor input data quality, the AI prediction distribution. So, if an AI has been predicting pneumonia, 3% of the time, and that jumps to 5%, it will flag that as an issue. If it happens in winter, you probably ignore it. If it happens in the middle of summer, you might question it. And then the third thing we measure is human automation bias. So we look at what the radiologist ended up saying, and we say, did they agree with the AI completely? And if they do, or if they did, we mark that as an agreement. And if somebody starts to agree with the AI too much, we flag that to the hospital and say, hey, this, Hugh Harvey is agreeing too much with this AI. You may want to have a chat with him. And that recently got accepted onto the MHRA's.
I think I'm the most least likely person to agree too much with AI.
So the MHRA are working with us now as part of the AirLock program to see how we can use that monitoring framework.
On that, do you want to just briefly describe the AirLock program to people who might not know?
Yeah, so, and it's a great example of how things are different to, say, 5-10 years ago. So the MHRA announced the AI AirLock program a few months ago, which is their effort to work with innovators to solve some of the regulatory barriers or confusing parts of the regulations to support safe and effective AI adoption of healthcare. And so we are working with them to see how a third-party monitor, like Newton's Tree, can help both the hospital and the AI vendor keep the AI safe, right? Obviously, it creates, some regulatory questions, like what's responsibility on us, what insurance policy do I need to have, these kinds of things. And so we're working together with NHS Trust, AI vendors, and the regulator to solve that together, which is the way we should be tackling these problems.
And that's in an airlocked data environment, or is that live deployment?
No, so we're doing it as a simulation. And that's the sort of airlock cover, basically. So we're going to do it first as a simulation in silico, and then once we pass through certain gates, then we are ready to do it in a more prospective setting.
And quick plug, how do people join that or get to work with you?
You can find a contact form, newtonstree.com. Newton as in Isaac Newton. I can tell you the story of why that's the name. But yeah, just find us on the website.
Thank you. Now, from your research and reports from the Health Foundation, what are the positives on the horizon?
Yeah, so despite everything we've just said, people are trying really hard to make this work. Often people ask me the question, but what are they doing in other countries? How can we learn from other countries? And actually, the answer a lot of the time is we're doing really well and we're leading the way in a lot of these areas. Often people are looking to the UK for how we're doing things, and they'll sit and wait and see what we do, and then they'll do it. So let's not get completely despondent and think we're behind the curve. Actually, we're relatively far ahead in it. But also just from a public and staff perspective, so our survey work shows that there is a broadly receptive environment for AI. The public and staff are not closed off to this. Over half of the public support the use of AI in care. That goes up to 2/3 of staff. 75% of the public are willing to give at least some of their data to power AI models. Half of people are happy to take part in activities to shape them. Let's take advantage of that goodwill and not ruin it. Let's get this right. But it's not like we're knocking on a closed door. People want this to happen, and let's work with them and get it right.
Thank you. It's good to know that there are some positives out of these, because these reports can sometimes kind of be doom and gloom. So I think it's always good to focus on both sides of the coin. And then we're going to have some questions from the audience in just a minute. But first, for you, Rachel, I was going to ask you a different question, not just the positives. But okay, we'll do those in a second. And it just goes on from a point that Nell just made. 75% of patients are happy to give some data for the use of training or validating AI. Do you think it's time that we have that national conversation with the entire public who use the NHS to say, look, it's going to remain free at the point of care, but part of the contract is the NHS just has free reign internally to use your data to train, validate, and monitor these AI systems? Is that going to be acceptable to patients? And if not, how might we get there?
I think we're already starting to have some public conversations, and we have the public conversation on the use of data, which hopefully will continue, that look very much at the trade-offs that will need to be. And as a society, we do have to have a conversation about the National Health and Care Service and how it can remain fit for the future. But there are safeguards that need to be put in place before those conversations happen, in terms of what you brought up a second ago around that kind of transparency and that trust but also knowing that there's a really strong legal basis that will protect patients and their data, and patients are looking for that because they are positive about it. And let's not use comparisons that we all have to do our banking online now. It's not a comparison. This is our bodies and our health and our futures that we're really interested in. But we do need to understand more about how it will work. So I think there will be a national conversation. I think there needs to be it'll be interesting to see what comes out of this current public deliberation. And I think, we do have a 10-year consultation into the, sorry, not a 10-year consultation, that's a bit of a Freudian slip, consultation into the 10-year health plan, of which, as we look at those shifts from analog to digital and hospital to communities and illness to prevention, the role of AI has to become a huge part of that, because we're not going to achieve it without it.
Indeed. So thank you very much to the panelists. Let's have a small round of applause. Thank you. And I'll open it up to you beautiful people. Oh, look, hands are already up to ask some questions. Do you want to come to the front and I'll hand you my microphone and say who you are and what your question is?
Thank you. It's very, very interesting insights that you shared. Thank you. So my name's Grant McKenzie. I'm the co-founder of Comfort Companions. We've developed a consumer electronics device for non-clinical use supporting elderly people in cognitive decline manage complex healthcare interactions. So something that strikes me is that doctors, when you go to see your GP, they're using Google. So Google's not a clinical tool. They're using Google anyway. And why are we... It seems like we're at risk of making the perfect the enemy of the good. The doctors should always be, the clinical professionals should always be the ones that make the decision, not an AI tool, at least for the foreseeable future. The AI tool can help them make the decision, but ultimately the doctor signs off on it. Why are we not focusing more on that clinical professional, training them to be able to avoid automation bias and be more critical in their analysis? Wouldn't that make things much easier from an implementation point of view if they just use it as they already use Google?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very good question. So, like I mentioned, things are not like they were 10 years ago. So we do have education programs. So one of my other roles is I'm director of the National Fellowship in Clinical AI, whose purpose is exactly that, right? So we take junior doctors or resident doctors and other mid-career healthcare professionals, and we give them a year-long vocational training program alongside their clinical job to allow them to become not only critical appraisers of AI technology, but to be leaders in safe and effective implementation. The reality, though, of that program, we're just recruiting for cohort 4, so those of you who are interested, applications are open. We're only accepting 35 fellows this year. That is a drop in the ocean, right, in terms of what is actually needed. When I mentioned that every trust is using AI, we do not have clinical AI fellows in every trust, right? And again, it's around investment. So there are some efforts to support physicians, as you've explained. We just need to really invest in it seriously.
No?
Yeah, I mean, yes, in short, is the answer. Yes, obviously we should make sure all clinicians are able to question the things that they're looking at, but the question is then, are you essentially downplaying the power of the technology by kind of giving it equivalence to a Google search? Because that's not how it's being sold. It's being sold to us as something that's going to revolutionize clinical care, it's going to transform this and do that. And then if you're saying, but you still need to question every single thing that you see, on the flip side, are we there kind of like nerfing the power of it by doing that?
I mean, the analog I can think of is if you bought, I don't know, a machine that can count white cells on a histopathology slide, and then you were told, well, you have to question it every single time you see a number. You're like, well, it's not a very useful device. It's like, I just want you to count and be accurate 99.9% of the time. And so there is that difference in terms of searching for knowledge and having something like very specifically being like clinical grade accuracy. And there's a difference in it's subtle, but there's a difference in that use case.
Yeah, I mean, the question is, what's the trade-off? And what are clinicians willing to accept as the trade-off?
We have lady in the red hat, yes. It's not that cold in here, is it?
Wow. Question my fashion choices. Thanks. So thanks for the discussion. There's really a lot that resonated with me, especially as we're developing AI technologies, such as like it needs to be diverse and represent the population it serves, from gender, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, disability, etc., etc. So I do have a two-part question, which is, so what practical steps then can we take to diversify and to ensure that training data sets are representative, given the barriers of costs and patient either adoption or satisfaction? And then following that, how can healthcare innovators like myself identify and mitigate the risk of bias in AI systems, especially when data availability varies significantly across demographics and/or geographies? Sorry, it's a mouthful.
Great question. Who wants to tackle that one?
I think I'll start, but I'm quickly handing over to Nal. I think for me, if we're going to tackle those questions, it's about how we design in partnership with the people that we expect to be using, which is the whole society, to be involved, every patient. So, and looking at those areas where we're already seeing growing inequalities, and how do we build partnership with communities. And I often get quoted at me that people have lived experience advisory panels. And there's been a word that's been going around here, and it's about power. And if you are only talking to the same patients all the time, if I was only talking to the same patients all the time in the patient association, I shouldn't be sitting up here. But we spend our time going out and trying to get to those voices that don't get heard. So I think that's something AI has to really, people developing have to really start thinking about how you're going to get to those different voices all the time.
Yeah, I mean, the work has already been done on looking at that kind of how do you ensure representation in data sets. Is it the Spirit AI initiative? Yeah, Spirit AI is something I definitely look at, but just, I know we're running out of time, but just to say bias doesn't start and end with your data. So getting your data right is one thing, but like I said earlier, like you could have a perfect system. If you're not trialing it with the right people, you know, most people who take part in tech development and clinical research are white retirees, like let's be honest. And they make careers out of giving their opinion, you know, and I'm not saying it's not valid, but I'm just saying there are other people in the room we need to talk to. Yeah. I didn't say this thought. So I just think, you know, let's just make sure that when we're like test these technologies, that actually like when we're looking at the room of people, we'll go, do you represent the country? And if they don't, then sort it out.
Yeah. We've run out of time. I'd love to continue. I'm going to ask all of you a favour. I want to make everyone else in the entire venue really jealous and experience some FOMO. So I'm going to ask you to give a round of applause. I want you to give the biggest round of applause, shout, cheer, holler, and we're going to keep going for 20 seconds. So the whole building's like, what the hell just happened in that room? That sounds amazing. So let's go. Are you ready? Go. Let's do it. Yes, yes, good. Thank you very much. I've been Hugh. These are the panelists. We'll mill here for some questions.